Right now, somewhere in your body, there's an enzyme that exists for one very specific reason: to break down alcohol. Not because you drink, because your ancestors, tens of millions of years before humans existed at all, were already doing it, completely by accident, every single day. This is the story of alcohol, and it starts long before agriculture, long before pottery, before anything you'd recognize as a bar or a brewery. It might start before our own species even existed. So here's the real question: did ancient humans actually drink alcohol? And if they did, was it deliberate, or was something much stranger going on? Start about 10 million years ago, deep in the forests of what's now Africa. Fruit falls from trees constantly. Some of it gets eaten right away. A lot of it doesn't. It lies on the forest floor, splits open, and sits there in the heat. And wild yeast, floating invisibly in the air pretty much everywhere on Earth, lands on that exposed sugar and starts eating it. That process produces exactly two things: carbon dioxide and ethanol, alcohol. Naturally, constantly, with no human or even primate involvement required at all. Overripe fruit on a forest floor is, chemically speaking, already a mild alcoholic beverage. It's been happening for tens of millions of years, since long before any primate ever picked up a piece of fruit on purpose. That raises an obvious question. If alcohol was just sitting there in fallen fruit the entire time, would anything actually eating that fruit have noticed? In 2000, biologist Robert Dudley proposed something now known as the drunken monkey hypothesis. His argument was straightforward. Our primate ancestors relied heavily on fruit for food. Overripe, fermenting fruit smells stronger than fresh fruit because the fermentation process itself releases a distinctive, easily detectable odor. For a primate foraging in a dense forest, that smell was actually useful information. It meant sugar, meant calories, meant a reliable meal. Dudley's argument was that natural selection may have favored primates who were specifically good at detecting that smell and drawn toward it. Not because alcohol itself was rewarding at first, but because it was a genuinely reliable signal pointing toward food. Here's where the story gets a lot more physical. Around 10 million years ago, a specific genetic mutation appeared in the ancestor we share with modern gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans. That mutation altered a gene called ADH4, and it made an enzyme in the digestive tract roughly 40 times more efficient at breaking down ethanol than the earlier version had been. 40 times. That's an entire metabolic system getting specifically upgraded for one narrow purpose. Researchers studying this mutation, including biochemist Matthew Kerrigan, found that this shift appears right around the same time our ancestors are believed to have moved toward spending more time on the forest floor, closer to fallen, fermenting fruit, rather than staying exclusively up in the canopy where fresher fruit was more available. Before that mutation, ethanol exposure was genuinely something to be cautious about, mildly toxic and costly to process. After it, a primate could eat moderately fermented fruit and metabolize the alcohol quickly enough to gain the calories without losing function. That one mutation may have quietly reshaped which of our ancestors survived long enough to reproduce. And it's not just an ancient primate story either. This same basic pattern shows up across the animal kingdom right now, in real time. In Malaysia, there's a plant called the bertam palm, and its flowers produce a nectar that ferments naturally on the plant itself, at a fairly consistent alcohol content, similar to a light beer. Researchers have documented pen-tailed tree shrews visiting those flowers repeatedly, drinking the fermented nectar regularly, in some cases consuming what would be, for their tiny body size, a genuinely significant amount of alcohol, with no outward signs of impairment. Their bodies, much like ours, appear specifically adapted to process it efficiently. Elephants in parts of Africa seek out fermented marula fruit deliberately, sometimes traveling real distances to reach it. Birds have been documented eating fermented berries and showing visibly altered flight patterns afterward. This isn't some rare biological fluke. Seeking out naturally fermented food appears to be a genuinely widespread behavior across a surprisingly broad range of species. And the mechanisms that let animals handle it evolved for a practical reason. Fermented food was already a normal, unavoidable part of the environment. So by the time actual Homo sapiens shows up, roughly 300,000 years ago, we're not starting from zero here. We're a species already biologically equipped, quite literally at the enzyme level, to process alcohol. And it turns out we didn't just process it accidentally. At some point, someone made it on purpose. Which brings us to Rockafet Cave on Mount Carmel in what's now Israel. In 2018, researchers led by archaeologist Li Liu published findings from a burial site connected to the Natufian culture dating back roughly 13,000 years, well before agriculture had really taken hold anywhere. Inside stone mortars at the site, researchers identified starch residue consistent with malted wheat and barley, grain deliberately soaked to trigger germination, then dried, ground, and processed in a way that closely matches the early steps of brewing beer. This wasn't an accident. Malting grain on purpose at the right moment in the right sequence requires real understanding of what you're doing. Here's what makes that discovery genuinely significant. The site is a burial ground. This wasn't casual everyday food production. This appears to have been beer made specifically for ritual use, quite possibly to accompany funerary feasts. 13,000 years ago, humans weren't just eating fermented food they happened to find. They were deliberately producing it for a specific cultural and spiritual purpose, well before they were farming grain as a primary food source at all. That timing connects to a much bigger, genuinely contested idea in archaeology, sometimes called the beer before bread hypothesis. The traditional story of agriculture goes like this. Humans domesticated wheat and barley primarily to make bread, and beer came along later, almost as an afterthought, a byproduct of already having surplus grain lying around. But some researchers, including archaeologist Patrick McGovern at the University of Pennsylvania, have argued the sequence might genuinely be backward. Wild grains actually make fairly poor bread on their own, low in gluten, difficult to grind efficiently, and not especially rewarding as a staple food. But those same wild grains ferment beautifully. If ritual, feasting, and the social value of alcohol were already deeply important to early communities, deliberately cultivating grain specifically to guarantee a reliable beer supply might have been a genuinely serious motivation behind the shift to farming, arguably as important as bread, possibly even more important in certain regions. This remains a real, ongoing debate. Nobody claims it explains agriculture entirely, but it's a serious, well-supported argument, not a fringe theory, and it flips the usual assumption about what people were actually trying to accomplish when they first started deliberately growing grain. There's a second discovery that pushes this idea even further. Göbekli Tepe, in what's now southeastern Turkey, is a massive complex of carved stone pillars arranged in circular enclosures dating back roughly 11,600 years. What makes it so strange is the timing. It was built by hunter-gatherers before agriculture, before permanent villages, before pottery even existed in the region yet. Nobody expected hunter-gatherers to organize the kind of coordinated labor required to move and carve stone pillars, weighing many tons each. Archaeologists excavating the site found large stone vats, some with a capacity of more than 150 liters. Chemical residue analysis found oxalate deposits inside them, a compound that specifically forms during the fermentation of cereal grains. The leading interpretation is that these vats were used to brew large batches of a beer-like beverage, almost certainly for massive communal feasts tied to the site's construction and its ceremonial purpose. Which raises a fascinating possibility. The shared desire to brew and drink together, at scale, may have been one of the very forces that pulled scattered hunter-gatherer groups into the kind of coordinated effort that produced Göbekli Tepe in the first place. Alcohol, in other words, may not just be a byproduct of early civilization. It might be one of the things that helped build it. Now let's jump to the opposite side of the ancient world, because this pattern doesn't show up just once. In Jiahu, in China's Henan province, archaeologist Patrick McGovern, the same researcher behind the beer before bread argument, led chemical analysis of pottery residue dating back roughly 9,000 years. What his team found was a genuinely sophisticated fermented beverage made from rice, honey, and fruit, specifically hawthorn fruit and wild grape. This wasn't a crude, accidental byproduct. It required combining 3 separate fermentable ingredients in careful proportion, understanding roughly how long fermentation needed to run, and repeating that process reliably enough to leave chemical traces across multiple vessels at the same site. 9,000 years ago, on the opposite side of the planet from Rockafet Cave and Göbekli Tepe, with zero possible contact between these cultures, people had independently arrived at deliberate, structured alcohol production. Which brings up the same question that seems to come up again and again in this kind of history. When a specific, fairly sophisticated behavior appears independently in unconnected regions separated by thousands of kilometers, it usually means the underlying conditions were simply universal enough that multiple groups of people found their way there on their own. Fruit ferments naturally almost everywhere on Earth. Grain, once you're gathering it in any real quantity, ferments almost by accident if it gets even slightly wet and is left alone. Honey, diluted with a bit of rainwater, ferments into mead essentially on its own, no deliberate effort required at all. The raw materials for alcohol were sitting around, in some form, in nearly every environment humans occupied. The real question was never really whether people would encounter fermentation. It was only ever a matter of time before someone, somewhere, learned to control it deliberately instead of just stumbling into it by accident. And once people had control over it, alcohol didn't stay a purely practical matter for very long. It became something closer to sacred. In ancient Sumer, roughly 3,800 years ago, someone wrote down what's now recognized as the oldest surviving beer recipe on Earth, and they wrote it as a hymn. The hymn to Ninkasi, addressed to the Sumerian goddess of beer, describes the actual brewing process in careful, structured detail. Soaking the grain, baking it into bread specifically meant to be crumbled and fermented, straining the finished mixture through a filter. It reads as both a genuine set of technical brewing instructions and a devotional religious song at the same time, because in Sumerian culture, those two things weren't considered separate at all. Beer wasn't simply a beverage. It was something worth genuinely worshipping. In ancient Egypt, beer functioned as a dietary staple, not primarily as a recreational drink. It was often noticeably safer to drink than the available water, and it delivered real calories and nutrients that mattered enormously in a labor-intensive society. Workers building the pyramids at Giza were regularly paid partly in beer, a substantial daily ration that made up a meaningful share of their actual caloric intake for the day. This wasn't some minor workplace perk. It was closer to a basic component of the wage itself, treated with the same seriousness as bread or grain. Egyptian tomb paintings show beer production in careful, repeated detail, and multiple deities were specifically associated with it, most notably the goddess Hathor. Wine, by contrast, occupied a more elite ceremonial position in Egyptian society, reserved disproportionately for the wealthy and for temple ritual, a genuine class distinction built directly into which fermented beverage you were actually drinking. Wine itself has its own separate, equally deep origin story. The current oldest confirmed evidence of deliberate grape wine production comes from Gadatrili Gora, in what's now the country of Georgia, dating back roughly 8,000 years. Researchers found chemical residue of tartaric acid, a compound strongly associated with grapes, embedded inside large clay storage vessels called qvevri, vessels that Georgian winemakers, remarkably, still use in essentially the same traditional form today. Grapes, unlike grain, ferment almost effortlessly. Their natural sugar content is high. Wild yeast lives right on the skin of the fruit itself, and crushing a large quantity of grapes together in a container is close to all it genuinely takes to start the process moving on its own. Wine may represent one of the single lowest effort paths to alcohol production in the entire ancient world, and the region's long, deep relationship with viticulture likely traces directly back to exactly how easy that initial process was. And it wasn't only fruit and grain either. On the vast steppes of Central Asia, communities eventually discovered they could ferment something else entirely: milk. Archaeological evidence from the Botai culture in what's now Kazakhstan, dating to roughly 5,500 years ago, shows clear indications of horse domestication, and residue evidence strongly suggests fermented mare's milk, a beverage still known today as kumis, was already part of the cultural picture at that time. Milk sugar, specifically lactose, can be fermented by particular strains of bacteria and yeast into a mildly alcoholic, faintly effervescent drink, In a landscape with limited grain and limited fruit, but genuinely abundant horses, people found yet another completely different biological pathway toward essentially the exact same outcome. Which brings us to something worth sitting with directly: grapes in Georgia, grain in the Fertile Crescent and in China, honey nearly everywhere fermentable sugar existed at all, mare's milk out on the open steppe. Wherever ancient humans settled, whatever specific resources happened to be locally available, they seem to have found their own independent route toward the exact same basic chemical outcome. That's not really a coincidence in any meaningful sense. It's what happens when a behavior is so deeply useful, and frankly so deeply rewarding, that people in dramatically different environments, with zero contact with one another, all arrive at fundamentally the same solution using whatever raw materials happen to be sitting right in front of them. So why does this pattern show up absolutely everywhere? Fermentation, at its core, doesn't actually require sophisticated technology. It requires sugar, water, and time. Plus wild yeast that's floating in the air almost everywhere on this planet, essentially all the time. You don't strictly need to add yeast on purpose. It's already there, constantly, invisibly, waiting for the right conditions to start working. Which means alcohol wasn't really a technology that got carefully invented in any single specific place. It was closer to a natural chemical process that human ingenuity eventually learned to notice, guide, and deliberately repeat on demand. The real invention here wasn't fermentation itself. Fermentation was already happening constantly, everywhere, all on its own. The real invention was control. Understanding how to reliably trigger it, direct it toward a specific desired outcome, and repeat that same result again and again, without leaving it entirely up to random chance. There's a reasonable case that alcohol's deep social role explains a genuinely surprising amount of what it eventually became. Shared drinking lowers social inhibition in ways that are now well documented by modern neuroscience. It reduces measurable stress markers. It increases observed trust between people. It makes group bonding meaningfully easier to establish. In small, tightly knit ancient communities where cooperation was directly tied to actual survival, anything that reliably strengthened group trust carried real, tangible value. A shared cup passed hand to hand around a fire wasn't only refreshment, it was a genuine social tool, deliberately used to build and reinforce the kind of connection a group needed to function and to survive together. And this actually loops all the way back to your own body, right now, sitting here listening to this. Remember that ADH4 mutation from around 10 million years ago, the one that made our distant primate ancestors dramatically more efficient at processing alcohol. That mutation didn't spread evenly across every human population on Earth. Roughly 36% of people with East Asian ancestry carry a variant of a related gene called ALDH2 that makes alcohol metabolism noticeably less efficient, producing the well-known flushing reaction, that rapid reddening of the face and noticeable discomfort some people experience after drinking even a small amount. Researchers studying the genetics believe this particular variant likely emerged sometime within roughly the past 10,000 years, potentially connected to regions where rice-based fermentation had already become deeply widespread and culturally significant for a very long time. In other words, the genetics of how efficiently your own body processes alcohol today may still be quietly shaped by choices your specific ancestors were already making thousands of years ago, in an environment already saturated with fermented rice and fermented grain. You are, in a very direct and literal sense, still walking around with the biological aftermath of your ancestors' relationship with alcohol. So was there alcohol in the ancient world? Overwhelmingly, unmistakably, yes. Not just present, but seemingly everywhere, independently discovered again and again across entirely different continents, different climates, and completely different available ingredients. From accidentally fermenting fruit on a prehistoric forest floor, to a genetic mutation 10 million years old that rewired how primates could process it, to deliberate ritual beer brewed for funerals 13,000 years ago. to massive stone vats at Göbekli Tepe that may have helped give rise to organized civilization itself, to a hymn written for a Sumerian goddess of beer, to wine still made today in Georgia using essentially the same clay vessels used 8,000 years ago. Alcohol isn't some late optional footnote tacked on to human history. It's threaded through nearly the entire story, from before we were even fully human, all the way to the glass sitting on your own kitchen counter tonight, still shaping how you personally process it, whether you feel that flush of warmth or not. So, does knowing all of this change how you think about a drink? Tell me honestly in the comments. If stories like this genuinely interest you, hit like. It helps the channel more than you'd probably think. And subscribe if you want more of how deep, strange, and genuinely ancient the ordinary things in your life actually are.